Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth when the people closest to you keep setting the price for you? Yesterday, at my own birthday table, my dad leaned back with that smug grin he saves for family gatherings and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that my sister was the true success story. I laughed weakly, pretending it was just a throwaway comment, but before I could even gather my breath, my boss, sitting right there beside me, tilted his glass and calmly added that it was interesting because my sister had just asked him to hire her. The table erupted in laughter, as if this was the punchline to some brilliant joke, but my sister's smile faltered for a split second, the kind of silence that is more telling than anything spoken. In that exact moment, I realized that whatever game she was playing, it had already reached my workplace, and that if I reacted emotionally, I would be written off as jealous or oversensitive. So I swallowed the sting, forced a tight grin, and started a mental countdown. I have learned, through more years in corporate than I care to admit, that the smartest move is never the one that feels good in the moment. The smartest move is the one you prepare carefully, letting everyone else think you are passive while you quietly line up the dominoes. And in that restaurant, with people cutting into overpriced cheesecake and clinking glasses, I was already making a decision. I would not fight for recognition at the table, because the table had already decided who the success story was. What I would do instead was collect, prepare, and strike where it actually counted. When I left the restaurant, I didn't storm off, didn't cry in the car, didn't call a friend to vent. I did something much smaller and much sharper. I opened a new message to the family group chat and wrote a cheerful recap of my week at work, a kind of, since Dad mentioned success, here's what I've been up to. I made it sound casual, like I was just sharing good news, but inside that little text I embedded a specific phrase I had just coined for a project milestone, something that was documented only in my notes and had not yet been made public. It looked harmless, even boring, to anyone else, but if that exact phrase showed up anywhere else, I would know exactly how it got there. By the next morning, I didn't even need to dig for proof, because there it was, Jenna's updated portfolio site, which she had linked on LinkedIn, now proudly displaying a bullet point that included the same unique phrase I had dropped into the group chat less than 12 hours earlier. It was as if she couldn't resist snatching it right up to dress herself with a bit of borrowed credibility. And the best part? She probably thought I would never notice. The truth is, this wasn't even new. Jenna had always been good at lifting words, stories, little pieces of my work and rebranding them as hers. Growing up, she would overhear me talk about a school project and then repeat my lines to my parents as though she had come up with them herself. My dad loved it because to him confidence looked like originality, and since Jenna always spoke louder, he never stopped to question where the ideas were coming from. That pattern never stopped, it just scaled with age. Now instead of school presentations, it was resumes and career narratives, and instead of impressing teachers, she was aiming at my actual boss. It would have been easy to fire off a furious message, call her out, demand she take it down. But that is the kind of thing that gets you branded the difficult one. What I needed was not noise, but structure. I needed the kind of evidence that speaks in boardrooms and HR offices, not in family dining rooms. So I sat quietly at my desk and pulled up my current project deck. I went through it slide by slide, inserting small, invisible marks, phrases, sequencing choices, non-public numbers that only made sense in context. Nothing that could damage the work, nothing that could be accused of being planted as bait, just enough to trace whether it showed up where it should not. At the same time, I sent a friendly, almost naive-sounding email to HR, attaching my most recent training certificate and asking if there were any refreshers on confidentiality planned for the quarter. The kind of note that looks like an employee simply being diligent, but in reality it anchored the fact that I was proactively concerned about internal material. HR doesn't react to drama. HR reacts to records. And now, there was one. When I finally sat down that evening, I replayed the birthday dinner in my head, and what stood out was not the laughter, not even my dad's little jab, but the way Aaron had said it, my sister just asked me to hire her. He didn't sound committed, he didn't sound reluctant, he sounded amused, like he saw it as entertainment. That was my first real clue. He liked having options. He liked holding cards, even if he never played them. That meant he was not loyal to her or me, only to himself. Which meant I could not count on him to shut this down, but I could absolutely count on him to leave a paper trail if it suited him. I went to bed that night not angry but focused. This was no longer just about a careless comment at a birthday table. This was about the way my family dismissed me while benefiting from me, and the way my boss toyed with the idea of swapping me out for a shinier story. And if there is one thing I know about both family politics and office politics, it is that appearances matter more than facts, until you make the facts undeniable. That is why I didn't confront Jenna directly. Instead, I kept every screenshot, every timestamp, every update. I smiled at her texts. I responded warmly. I let her think the game was still in her control. Because I knew exactly what I was doing, setting the board so that when the time came, the truth wouldn't be an argument. It would be a record, and it would be undeniable. Can you guess what happened next? The unique phrase I had planted didn't just end up on her portfolio. Within 2 days, it appeared in a candidate submission packet that HR forwarded to me for a review. They wanted my input on whether the skills listed aligned with our department's needs, and there it was again, word for word, in Jenna's so-called work sample. And just like that, the trap had sprung. When the email from HR landed in my inbox with that polite request for a quick touchpoint regarding a candidate sample, I already knew which thread they were tugging, because I had woven it for them with the patience of someone who has finally accepted that the only person who will protect her work is herself. And that acceptance brings a level of calm that looks like detachment, but is actually a plan that has grown legs and is now walking on its own. Before that message arrived, I had taken my sister to coffee under the pretense of sisterly advice, and I watched her settle into the role she prefers. The confident storyteller who paints her ambition as a win for everyone while keeping the scorecard in her lap, and I let her talk through her pitch about how our working together would be a family dream, how Dad would finally relax, how the company culture clearly needed fresh energy, which, translated from Jenna, means cut the line, borrow whatever glitters, and smile like it was always meant to be yours. I asked friendly questions about her experience, and each answer she gave sounded like a recycled summary of things I had said aloud in kitchens and cars and holiday living rooms, except now she had smoothed the edges to make them sound native to her. And I felt that old tug of resentment try to climb up my throat, but I kept it down because I was not there to correct her autobiography, I was there to record it. I told her, with my best helpful older sister voice, that I would gladly share a preview of a process deck, since our teams cared about consistency, and since it might help her understand how we frame milestones to clients. And she brightened in that way that always made Dad soften, as if her gratitude was proof of innocence, while I knew, with the dull certainty you develop after enough repeats of the same scene, that she would treat my generosity as a signal that boundaries did not exist, and that she could take what she liked without ever saying the words take or borrow or steal. I went home and prepared a special copy, a clean and harmless version for feedback, with a single fabricated metric embedded in a line that looked believable to anyone skimming, but would be nonsense to anyone who actually runs our models. And I saved it with a normal name, because traps work best when they do not advertise themselves as traps. Sending that file felt almost too easy, not because I enjoyed it, but because the pattern had become that predictable, and predictability is a gift when you are tired of arguing about what is obvious. Since argument depends on opinion while patterns depend on repetition, and repetition leaves footprints that are much harder to wave away. I included a cheerful note asking for her thoughts and telling her that Erin always appreciated concise, data-anchored phrasing, which I knew would light up the little reward center in her mind that always responds to the idea of sounding like management. And then I set my phone face down and got back to actual work. The next morning began with a calendar update from Erin pretending to be neutral, something about exploring candidate options that might add breadth to the team, which is the kind of language people use when they want to be seen as open without committing to any specific action that might be measured later, and I answered with the bland acknowledgement he prefers. Because people like Aaron mistake blandness for cooperation, and that mistake often buys you time. I spent that time tightening my documentation, not with drama, but with receipts, quiet and boring receipts that tell stories better than any monologue, and I felt a steady steadiness settle in. The kind you get when you have moved from defending your dignity to defending your facts. The coffee with Jenna replayed in my mind as I worked, especially the part where she wrapped a hand around my forearm and said we could finally be a team, and I almost laughed because I had given up on that dream years ago, not because I did not want it, but because team implies mutual risk and mutual credit, while what she wanted was an elevator key and my willingness to press the buttons. I pictured Dad telling me to be supportive, to be less rigid, to remember that family comes first, and I accepted that to him family has always meant pleasing the loudest voice at the table, which is why I would never again measure myself by that applause. By midday, Jenna sent a string of thumbs-up words without substance, the kind of feedback that confirms someone did not actually read the file, and signed off with a promise to integrate the language in her materials for consistency. And I smiled at the screen because the mask had slipped so cleanly that I did not need to tug it. I archived the thread, updated my log, and went back to work. The HR email landed that afternoon with a courteous tone and a link to a secure folder, asking me to review a candidate's writing sample for alignment with our department framework, and I opened it with a calm I had earned, scrolled, and found the exact phrase that did not exist in any world but mine and the one decoy file I had seeded, sitting there in a paragraph that tried to sound authoritative, and I felt the kind of vindication that does not taste like victory yet, because the game is still live, but it does taste like proof. I did not gloat, did not forward it to the family chat, did not call anyone. I replied to HR with measured professionalism, thanked them for including me, and requested a short meeting to clarify authorship and confidentiality, adding that I would bring the version history for context. Before I shut my laptop, I sent one more small note, a gentle nudge to Aaron saying that HR had reached out for a routine review and that I would keep him posted, which is the kind of sentence that does not accuse anyone but lands like a mirror placed at the right height, and then I closed the lid and let the silence do what it always does when people realize the air has shifted. The next morning, right on time, HR confirmed the meeting and asked me to bring the training certificate I had mentioned, the original deck, and the timeline of distribution, and as I slipped the printed copies into a folder, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna asking if I could hop on a quick call before lunch because she wanted to run something by me about our deck, and I looked at her words and felt, for once, no need to rush, because the door that had always been propped open by obligation had finally clicked shut, and the hallway ahead was bright enough to navigate without anyone's permission. Can you guess what happened next? When I walked into HR, Monique was not alone, and the second chair at the table had already been filled. When I walked into HR and saw that second chair already pulled up to the table, I knew before introductions were even exchanged that this meeting was not going to be the usual half-hearted check-in about procedure or documentation, because Monique, our HR manager, only brought in an additional presence when she expected the discussion to travel beyond the surface level of policy reminders and into the territory where phrases like conflict of interest and compliance review start circling like vultures. Sitting beside her was a quiet man in a gray suit who introduced himself as part of the internal compliance team, and the look on his face was not hostile but unreadable, the kind of practiced neutrality you only ever see on people who are there to observe, record, and measure reactions. That neutrality told me two things instantly. First, this was no longer about whether my sister had borrowed a few phrases for a portfolio sample, and second, Aaron's name had already crossed someone's desk, because the company only calls compliance in when leadership itself might be implicated. I sat down, opened my folder, and laid out the materials without any dramatic preamble, because I understood that the way to win in a room like that is not through emotion, but through order, and order, in this case, meant printed copies of the original deck with timestamps, the training certificate I had sent earlier, and the comparison that showed exactly where the fabricated metric from my decoy file had been lifted and presented as original work. I explained calmly that I had shared the preview with my sister under the assumption of informal feedback, that I had then seen the identical language resurface in a candidate sample HR had forwarded for my review, and that I had reason to believe this posed not only a question of intellectual property, but also the larger issue of a hiring pipeline involving a direct relative of mine, approached through my manager, without any disclosure or guardrails. Monique did not nod, did not offer sympathy, did not even look surprised. She simply made small notes while the compliance officer asked clarifying questions about file distribution, version history, and the context of my sister's approach. He asked whether Aaron had ever directly instructed me to share materials, and I said no, but I mentioned the birthday dinner comment where he casually revealed that Jenna had asked him for a role, which seemed to amuse him more than concern him at the time. The officer did not smile, but he did underline something in his notebook, and I knew then that Aaron's attempt to float above the mess by framing it as entertainment had in fact placed him right in the center of a potential policy violation. As the conversation unfolded, I felt no need to embellish or dramatize, because the facts carried their own weight, and the more plainly I presented them, the more undeniable they became. I pointed to the fabricated metric, explained its origin, and showed how it appeared in the candidate's submission word for word. I highlighted the timeline: coffee with my sister, file sent, vague feedback received, HR packet arriving, discovery of the lifted content. Each step lined up with a neat timestamp, and each timestamp narrowed the margin for coincidence until coincidence was no longer a plausible defense. Aaron was called in midway through the meeting, and his body language said everything his words tried to avoid. He walked in with that same casual grin he wears in team huddles, the one that usually diffuses tension by making him look approachable. But when Monique explained the concern about the overlap between my deck and the candidate submission, and when the compliance officer laid out the importance of recusal when family members are involved, the grin tightened at the corners, because he realized too late that this was not a conversation he could charm his way out of. He tried to suggest that my sister was only exploring opportunities and that he had never formally advanced her application, but Monique cut him off with the phrase, perceived conflict, which in HR language is the same as a loaded weapon, because perception is enough to trigger action even if intent cannot be proven. I sat there, hands folded, saying little, because the less I said, the more his words echoed in the silence, and the silence made clear that his position was weaker than mine. At one point, he attempted to deflect by suggesting that perhaps I had shared more than was appropriate, but before the accusation could hang in the air, I slid across the printed copy of the decoy deck and explained that the incriminating metric did not exist in any sanctioned version of our materials. That moment was decisive because it reframed the entire conversation from one of messy family dynamics into one of deliberate misuse of internal documents, and once that shift occurs, HR loses interest in gossip and locks onto procedure, because procedure is their shield. By the end of the meeting, the outcome was clear. Jenna's candidacy was frozen indefinitely. Aaron was formally instructed to recuse himself from any discussion or decision related to her, and compliance would conduct a brief review to determine whether further escalation was necessary. To the outside world, those words might sound bureaucratic, but in practice, they meant that the door Jenna had been trying to pry open was now not only closed, but sealed with tape and a warning sign, and Aaron, who had thought of her approach as a playful option, now carried the quiet stigma of having his judgment questioned. I left the room without triumph in my step, because this was not the final move, but I felt the first click of control settling back into my hands. The people who had laughed at the birthday table did not know it yet, but the game had already changed. That evening, I sent one last, carefully crafted email, this time not to HR, not to Aaron, not even to Monique. I sent it to the confidential audit inbox that bypasses middle management and routes directly to the board's oversight committee, attaching the same documentation I had shared in the meeting, stripped of commentary and presented only as a factual account of events. It was not an act of spite, but an act of insurance, because I understood that Aaron's instinct would be to minimize and reframe, and I wanted a record beyond his reach. When I pressed send, I knew there was no undoing it, and I knew that whatever came next would be larger than family squabbles or workplace politics. I had just shifted the story from whispers and jabs into the realm where oversight committees ask questions, where reputations can tilt, and where my quiet patience could no longer be mistaken for passivity. This changes the rules forever. Aaron thought recusal would be the end of it, a quick administrative bandage to close the wound. He was wrong, because recusal is not resolution, and what comes after will test him far more than it will ever test me. The fallout began faster than I had anticipated, and it did not arrive in the form of an official memo or a formal letter, but rather through whispers, small shifts in tone, and the sudden appearance of silences that had not been there before. The kind of silences that stretch across a conference call when someone once eager to speak now waits carefully to hear how others will respond before committing. My sister, never one to sit quietly when her pride is bruised, turned to the only tactic she has ever known when cornered: accusation. She called our father and told him I was blocking her opportunities out of jealousy, that I was hoarding influence and shutting doors because I could not bear to share the spotlight, and predictably, Dad called me the very same evening with his voice loaded with disappointment, telling me that families should build each other up and that I had embarrassed us all by dragging trivial rivalries into the workplace. For a moment, I almost allowed myself to be pulled into the same cycle that had trapped me for years, where his opinion of me dictated how I measured my worth, but I stopped myself. Because I had spent too much energy proving myself to people who had already decided who the star was, and I refused to rehearse that script again. Instead of defending or pleading, I told him that he was free to believe whatever story he preferred, but I was not going to compromise my career to preserve his illusions about fairness, and then I hung up before the guilt could settle. At work, Aaron tried his own version of damage control. He called me into his office, closing the door with that practiced gesture of managers who want to signal confidentiality without actually offering safety, and told me that maybe it would be a good idea if I took a week off to let things cool down. He framed it as concern for my well-being, but the subtext was clear. If I removed myself from the day-to-day, it would be easier for him to smooth things over with whoever he needed to placate, whether that was HR, compliance, or even my sister. I looked him directly in the eye and said no, because stepping away would only feed the narrative that I was unstable, and I reminded him calmly that I had client deliverables scheduled, ones that carried revenue implications he could not easily explain away if they failed. His face hardened slightly, and for the first time I saw not the polished charm, but the faint irritation of someone realizing their usual tools of persuasion were losing power. I knew then that I could not rely solely on the company's internal processes to protect me, because processes bend under pressure from those who have more influence, and Aaron had been around long enough to know which levers to pull. So I decided to anchor myself where influence had less sway: results. I began preparing for a client showcase call that would not only highlight the success of our recent project, but would also tie those outcomes directly to decisions I had led, documented, and shepherded through obstacles. I rehearsed answers not for the client's benefit, because I already knew they valued the work, but for the benefit of anyone listening internally who might question whether my role was essential. At the same time, I quietly reached out to a contact at a partner firm, someone who had once floated the idea of me joining their team, and asked for a candid conversation about opportunities. I did not frame it as desperation but as curiosity, and they responded warmly, offering to draft a preliminary offer if I was truly interested. Having that external option sitting in my inbox gave me a kind of strength I had not felt in years, because it reminded me that my future was not tethered to the approval of my boss or my family, and that leverage, once secured, can shift the balance of any negotiation. The day of the showcase call arrived, and I made one strategic choice that turned out to be the most decisive move of the entire ordeal. I invited a board observer from the audit committee to join as a neutral guest, framing it as a gesture of transparency given the recent questions surrounding team dynamics. No one could object to such transparency without looking defensive, so the invitation stood, and when the call began, I walked through the project with steady precision, giving credit to the team where appropriate, but structuring every answer to point back to the leadership decisions I had made. The client asked two pointed questions about strategy, and I answered them clearly, tying each response to documented milestones that bore my name. When the call ended, the client expressed satisfaction, the team looked relieved, and the board observer, who had barely spoken throughout, lingered for just long enough to ask me privately for a copy of my resume. That one request told me more than any congratulatory email could have, because it meant that my competence had been witnessed at the level where narratives are written into performance reviews and promotion discussions. And it meant that Aaron's attempts to reduce me to a liability had failed in front of someone who mattered more than him. Meanwhile, Jenna escalated in the only way she knew, by playing victim. She sent messages to relatives about how I had humiliated her, how I had sabotaged her chance to grow, how I had made her feel small in front of professionals. Dad repeated her words back to me almost verbatim, urging me to reconcile, but by then I had learned to treat his echoing of her perspective as background noise rather than truth. That night, I received a calendar invite from Aaron for a private meeting, and the subject line was simple but telling: moving forward. His tone had shifted completely, and when he spoke, there was no charm, no casual amusement, only the careful phrasing of a man who had realized that the board's eyes were no longer just on me, but on him, and that his choices from this point on would either compound his vulnerability or offer him a slim path to redemption. Do you know what people really think about you when the curtains are pulled back? I was about to find out, not from whispers or family gossip, but from the words of my own boss, spoken under pressure and stripped of the power he once believed he had over me. The private meeting with Aaron was held in his office late in the afternoon, after most of the team had already left, and the timing itself told me everything I needed to know, because people like him prefer to negotiate in shadows, without witnesses, hoping that an air of intimacy will soften resistance and that the absence of an audience will allow for compromises that would never survive the daylight. He began in the same tone he had always used when trying to coax cooperation from me, measured and almost paternal, explaining that he valued my contributions and that the company recognized my importance, but that it would serve everyone better if we focused on repairing optics rather than prolonging tension. He offered, with the confidence of someone who believed this was generous, a public commendation for my leadership on the recent project, along with a salary adjustment that he assured me was competitive. He hinted, almost casually, that my sister might still find her place in the organization down the line, in some other role that did not technically conflict with mine, and he implied that agreeing to such an arrangement would help close this chapter and restore balance. I listened without interrupting, not because I was intimidated, but because I understood that every word he said was not truly addressed to me, but to the invisible record he was trying to construct for himself. A record in which he appeared conciliatory, generous, and pragmatic, while casting me as the one who needed to be soothed and placated. When he finally finished, I did not thank him, and I did not smile. Instead, I placed my folder on the desk between us and laid out my terms, calmly and clearly, as if I were reading from a prepared contract. I told him that I would accept nothing less than a formal promotion with defined authority that matched the responsibilities I had already been carrying, that I expected my name attached to the client's successes in official communications, and that he would personally deliver a statement to the team about the company's anti-nepotism policy, one that explicitly underlined why family members cannot be considered for roles under the supervision or influence of relatives. I also made sure to mention that I had an external offer already in writing, with numbers and responsibilities that made it a viable option, and that I was prepared to walk if my conditions were not met. The shift in his expression was almost imperceptible but unmistakable. His attempt at charm drained, his shoulders stiffened, and he realized that he was not negotiating with someone desperate for approval, but with someone holding leverage he could not erase. He asked whether I would be willing to soften the message, perhaps frame it less directly, but I told him that clarity was the only currency that mattered to me now, and that if he wanted me to stay, he would meet my terms without dilution. He studied me for a long moment, then finally agreed, because the risk of losing me altogether, especially under the shadow of an external offer and the board observer's interest, was greater than the discomfort of conceding. A week later, The all-hands meeting opened with Aaron reading from a statement, his voice carrying the forced neutrality of a man performing penance under orders. He announced my promotion, naming me explicitly as the lead responsible for the client success that had strengthened the company's standing, and he followed with a formal acknowledgement of the anti-nepotism policy, citing the importance of fairness, transparency, and respect for intellectual contributions. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that means people are processing more than clapping, and in that silence I felt something heavier than applause settle, recognition that could not be withdrawn with a careless joke at a dinner table. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it short but intentional. I presented a talk I had prepared titled, "One Rule That Replaces 100 Tips. If it's yours, sign it." I explained that credit is not vanity but accountability, that ownership of work protects not only the individual but the entire team from confusion and misuse, and I thanked HR for upholding the standard that made our success sustainable. I did not mention Jenna, I did not mention Dad, and I did not mention the birthday table. I simply let the message land where it needed to, in the minds of people who had been watching, listening, and waiting to see whether I would flinch. After the meeting, Jenna cornered me outside the building, her tone swinging between bitterness and pleading, accusing me of humiliating her while asking whether I had really blocked every path for her. I looked her in the eye and told her that I had referred her name to a partner company that actively trained entry-level hires, a place where she could prove herself without leaning on my materials or my reputation. She looked stunned, because generosity was not what she expected, and she muttered something about not wanting charity. I told her it was not charity but an honest chance to build her own path, one she had never taken because it lacked shortcuts. She left without answering, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to chase her approval or Dad's. That evening, Dad called again, trying to deliver one last jab, saying that family should come before pride, that maybe I had won, but at the cost of harmony. I let him speak, and when he finished, I simply said that harmony built on someone else's silence is not harmony at all, it is control, and I told him I would no longer participate in that version of family loyalty. Then I paid the check for my own dinner and enjoyed the quiet of a room where I did not need to argue for my place. The external offer remained open, waiting in my inbox, and while I did not rush to accept it, knowing I had it gave me a freedom that no title or commendation could fully provide. For the first time in years, I felt that my value was no longer a debate staged by my father, a performance judged by my sister, or a game maneuvered by my boss. It was mine, defined by my choices, documented by my results, and reinforced by the fact that I had turned the tables not through cruelty or theatrics, but through strategy, patience, and timing. Are you ready to see yourself 10 years from now? I am, because I know that when that day comes, I will not measure my worth by whether my family ever applauded me, or whether Aaron ever truly respected me, but by the knowledge that when the moment demanded it, I refused to bend, I refused to be silenced. And I made sure that the record itself bore my name.